Hello and welcome to this lesson on endocrine communication. So I'm recording this for you from my paternity leave, but I'm going to be back next week. But we've got 3 lessons this week with me. You'll have 2 with Miss Beatty. And the 3 lessons that you're going to have with me are the first 2 lessons on endocrine communication. And the 3rd lesson you're going to have with me is going to be to basically correct your paper, to correct your 2018 breadth paper that you did for your mock exam. So those are my 3 lessons this week, and then I'll be back after that. So let's get started on this lesson, endocrine communication. We're going to really just kind of explain the principles of endocrine communication today. So first of all, I'd like you to answer these 3 questions. I'd like you to answer them, written answers in your book. So pause the video whilst you answer those, and then I'll give you some answers. Okay, so the first one, why do organisms need communication systems? Give an example. Well, there's loads of different reasons, but it's basically to respond to changes that could be internal or they could be external. So, for example, internal temperature changes. If you were to get colder internally, then you could start to shiver, which causes the generation of heat. That word thermogenesis means making heat. Thermo is heat, genesis is making. Okay, trickier. There are 2 main communication systems in the human body. What's the difference, really? Compare and contrast. Well, the 2 systems are the hormonal system and the nervous system. Now, the hormonal system we call the endocrine system at A level. So really, endocrine is better than hormonal. So the answer there on the right-hand side. The nervous system tends to be really fast, rapid, specific, and short-lived. For example, if I want to move this finger, it's a short-lived response, it just happens once, and it's specific to that finger. And it's very quick, I can move that very quickly. Whereas the hormonal system tends to be longer-term changes over a wider area. For example, after you eat, insulin is released that stores glucose throughout many different areas in the body, and it's a longer-term, slower change. Trickiest one, negative feedback loop and positive feedback loop. Well, again, temperature control is a negative feedback loop. If I get too hot, my body starts to sweat, that loses heat energy, so that's negative feedback. Likewise, there's another negative feedback loop involved in glucose regulation. We will look at that in more detail. Positive is a bit harder. The 2 main ones are birth and oxytocin. Having just been at a birth, I'm very familiar with this one. So basically what happens is every time you get a contraction. So when my daughter was born, it took a while. When the contractions started, they were sort of not as forceful and quite far apart. And every contraction releases a wave of hormone called oxytocin, but that causes the next round of contractions to be stronger and closer together. And basically that positive feedback builds and builds and builds until the contractions are happening close and are very powerful, and then you get birth. Another one is platelet activation, and the blood clotting sort of response is a positive feedback sort of mechanism. Okay, so that's a bit of recap from what we looked at about homeostasis before. Let's just quickly blitz through some more recap. So homeostasis, you've done this already, you don't really need to write this down, we did this at the beginning of the year, is the maintenance of a constant internal environment within a living organism. If we take that word apart, those are what the different parts of the word mean. Homeo is the same, and stasis is state. These are some things that need to be maintained. We've already looked at body temperature, and we're going to look at blood glucose in quite a lot of detail in this module. You've also looked at water potential of blood and blood salt concentration quite a lot with Miss Beatty, because you looked at excretion and how the kidneys work. You know about, for example, the mechanism of action of ADH, which is a hormone, and that is part of the endocrine system. So normally, the standard response pathway is something like this. We have a stimulus, a receptor detects that stimulus, then we communicate somehow through cell signaling. Now that could be hormonal communication. And then we have an effector and a response. There's a definition of negative feedback. If you've forgotten, pause the video if you need to write any of that down. This is recap. And here's a definition of positive feedback. Again, this is recap, so pause the video if you need to look at that or write that down. Okay, so now let's get on to some new stuff. And we're working from page 64 of your textbook. So first thing to do is to write down these 3 key definitions. They're from page 64, but I put them here just for your convenience. So pause this video and make a note of these 3 key definitions. All right, so the endocrine system is a communication system using hormones as signaling molecules. Hormones themselves, now these are molecules. Now they can be lots of different types of molecules. They could be proteins or they could be steroids, and they're released by glands, okay? They're released by endocrine glands into the blood. This is really, really important. They act as messengers, carrying a signal from the gland to a specific target organ of a tissue. I would say this definition here is extremely important. You really need to sort of memorize this definition here. You need to know that, the key facts there. Glands produce the hormones, they're released into the blood, so the hormones travel in the blood, they act as messengers, and they bind to a specific target organ or tissue. The third definition, is about that target organ or tissue. So in that target organ or tissue, there are target cells, and they possess a specific receptor on their cell surface membrane that will bind to the hormone that comes in. Okay, right. Let's start to look at this a bit more. So here's some sort of key facts. You can write it down if you want. So hormones, they are substances that stimulate target cells via the blood. So here we have a little picture, kind of a blood vessel, and we can imagine these yellow dots are hormone molecules traveling in the bloodstream. So they're released from endocrine glands, and each hormone has specific target cells on which it acts. So not every single hormone can act on every single cell. They are specific because of the receptors. So so hormones are part of the endocrine system, and it tends to produce slow, long-lasting, and widespread responses. So first thing to do, copy this diagram. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just draw a kind of a sort of man, woman in your book. Not looking for the artistic merit. Copy the outline and the rough position of these key glands, and then we're going to label them and maybe just briefly state which hormone is produced, okay? So pause the video if you need to. Finish drawing your human body outline. Okay, now let's get into these different glands. I'm just going to switch my thing here. Here we go. And let's make that bigger. Okay, so here we go. Let's look at these things. Right, so first of all, in the actual brain, at the base of the brain, there's the pituitary gland. Just below the hypothalamus, it's this kind of little P-shaped thing that hangs off the bottom of the brain. And it produces a lot of hormones, LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH. So those are involved in the regulation of the menstrual cycle. Okay, so those are 2 hormones released into the blood by the pituitary gland. Below the brain, kind of in the neck region, in about here, this is the thyroid gland. Now it releases the hormone thyroxine, which helps to control your kind of overall, your sort of baseline metabolic rate. Other fact to know about this is the hormone thyroxine has iodine in it, okay, the element iodine. So if you don't have enough iodine, what actually happens is the thyroid gland tries to work hard because it's not getting enough iodine to do its job, so it actually swells up, and you get a condition called goiter, which is a very swollen neck. But that's doesn't tend to happen unless you have a very restricted diet. Just an interesting fact there. Okay, so that's thyroxine metabolic rate. Now down here in the pancreas, don't worry about copying this yet. We will later on. The key message about the pancreas is that not all of it is an endocrine gland. The pancreas does many jobs, and there are specific parts of it that are kind of like little micro glands within the pancreas, and those are called the islets of Langerhans. So they produce insulin and glucagon. Okay, so 2 hormones are produced by the islets of Langerhans to be released into the blood: insulin and glucagon. There are other things. The pancreas does other things involved with the digestion. We're going to look at that in more detail in about 2 or 3 lessons' time. Okay, below the pancreas, we've got these 2 things. Hopefully you recognize those. You studied them with Ms. Beatty. They are the kidneys. Now you may remember that in the kidneys you have things like the renal artery and the renal vein. Now, above the kidneys, there's something called the adrenal gland. Adrenal basically means close to the kidneys. Renal is the part of the word that means kidneys. So adrenal glands just above the kidney, and they release lots of hormones, including adrenaline. So they kind of sit like a little triangle-shaped thing on top of the kidney, and they release adrenaline. Now, in a later lesson, about 2 lessons' time, we're going to look at the different layers of the adrenal gland. You don't need to draw this for now. But the different layers release different hormones, and you do need to know a little bit about that. Below the kidneys, the other 2 glands, now we're talking about differences between men and women. So the ovaries, these 2 here, in women, they produce estrogen and progesterone. And then here are the testes that produce testosterone. So those are the sex hormones that are responsible for the development of secondary sexual characteristics. So it's, sort of the changes that occur to men and women during puberty. Okay, so quick check. Can you remember, maybe turn your book over, which one does which? Okay, just see if you can do this in your head. Can you remember which does which? Which of these glands produce which hormone? Okay, write it down if you want to, or just do it in your head, and then we'll do the answers. Okay, going to give you the answers now. Pause if you haven't finished. Here we are. Ta-da! There we are. So adrenal gland, adrenaline. Pancreas, insulin and glucagon. Thyroid gland, thyroxine, iodine in there, remember. Pituitary gland, FSH and LH. Ovaries, progesterone and progesterone. Testes is testosterone. Okay, now let's get back to this PowerPoint. So hopefully you've created now kind of a little diagram which has those different hormones around your drawing, which I put there. Right, just a little bit on something called an exocrine gland, but we will spend more time on this when we look at the pancreas. Exocrine glands are different from endocrine glands, and they don't release chemicals into the blood. Okay, so that's the difference. They tend to release, not hormones, they tend to release substances into ducts, into tubes. So saliva glands, for example, they release saliva into a salivary duct, which carries the saliva into your mouth. So that would be an exocrine gland. Mammary glands secrete milk into ducts that then feeds a baby. Gastric glands secrete digestive juices into, let's say, the stomach. So you have exocrine glands around the stomach that put digestive juices and acid into the stomach. And sebaceous glands, they release kind of oily sebum into these little ducts that sort of carry that greasy stuff out onto the surface of the skin. Okay, now, 2 types of hormone you need to know about. The first one are protein or peptide hormones, or hormones that are kind of related to amino acids in structure. Now, the key things about these is they are water soluble, so they are hydrophilic, water soluble, and therefore they cannot get across a phospholipid bilayer. Okay, now so they have to work by doing something called triggering a second messenger, which is often cyclic AMP. That's this word down here, CAMP. So pause, write this down. I'm going to sort of explain a bit more about it, but get this into your book now. Okay. The second type of hormone is a steroid hormone. Now, steroid hormones are hydrophobic. You may remember that cholesterol is basically a steroid, so and it is lipid soluble. So steroid hormones are generally made from cholesterol. Now, remember that in your phospholipid bilayer structure, cholesterol can sit in the middle of the bilayer there. So steroid hormones, which are often made using cholesterol, they also can get into the middle of that phospholipid bilayer. So they can just diffuse through the membrane, which means they can kind of be traveling outside a cell, go through the membrane into the cell, and then they bind directly to DNA to trigger changes in gene expression. So steroid hormones, in a sense, work in a more simple way because they can cross the membrane, whereas protein or peptide hormones, they have to trigger a second messenger because they can't get across the membrane. Again, pause the video and make sure you've written all this information down in your book. Okay, right, now we're going to draw this diagram in a minute, but I actually came up with an animation first. So I'm just going to skip through this. I'll go back to it in a second. Right, here's my animation which I just made. All right, so hopefully you recognize where we are, sort of. Here we are. This is the outside of the cell. You don't need to write any of this thing, any of this thing down. And first thing that happens is we have a hormone. Okay, so this is the hormone adrenaline. Here it is. And adrenaline can't get through the bilayer. It cannot do this. Okay, can't do that because it is hydrophilic, water soluble, and it can't get through this phospholipid bilayer here. So what does it do? Well, it has to go down here and bind to a receptor. So this molecule here is a receptor. Now, as it binds to that receptor, the receptor changes shape. I tried to illustrate that by a little wobble. So it changes its 3D conformation. I'll show you that again. So it binds, 3D conformation changes, and what that does is it passes on the message. So let's call this as the receptor. And then this down here is called a G protein. So G protein, now once it's activated, it binds to something called GTP. That actual little bit there is beyond A level. You don't need to know about GTP, but I just thought you might make it a bit more understandable. So it binds to this molecule and then it goes off. It moves, okay? It actually moves across on the inside surface of the membrane, and it then goes and binds to another massive protein that's sitting in the membrane. And this big old protein here is called adenyl cyclase, okay? Don't worry about writing this down yet because we will write it down in a minute. Adenyl cyclase. Now what adenyl cyclase does, now that it's kind of activated by the G protein, there it is, it's activated. Now it can catalyze this reaction. So it takes ATP and turns it into cyclic AMP. Now, what are these words, ATP and cyclic AMP? If I just, sorry, change my pen color, I'm going blue over here. So you can sort of see here, this is ATP, it's got 1, 2, 3 phosphates in a line, linear. Here, we can see that those phosphates have kind of looped round. Actually, it's kind of joined with itself here. So this here, this kind of loop here is the cyclic bit. So now it's formed cyclic AMP. Now this here is very important, and that is what's called a second messenger. And the second messenger can now, it's basically like, it's a bit like the hormone, but acting inside the cell now. So let me show you all that animation again, and then we'll label it. All right, so here we go. Adrenaline comes in, can't get through the membrane, binds to the receptor. Receptor changes conformational shape. And then this activates the G protein. It binds to GTP. Then off it goes, moving along on the inside surface of the membrane. Now it binds to and activates adenyl cyclase. That adenyl cyclase can now catalyze, it's an enzyme, catalyze the formation of ATP into cyclic AMP. Okay? Now let's see if you can repeat that back. What I'll do is I'll be quiet. I'll just click through the animation, and can you describe to me what's going on as if I was sitting in front of you, okay? Let's just go back to that. See if you can do this. And in fact, let me discard all those ink annotations so to see if you can do it without any of the annotations, okay? So what's going on? And then why does it have to do this? What's going on there? What's this green box down at the bottom? What was that? What's this? What's happening there? And then finally, what is this? And what is the significance of that final molecule? Okay. Did you get that? Right, let's write it down in our books so we've got it solid. Okay, I want you to basically copy this diagram. Again, I'm not looking for amazing artistic quality, but this is the diagram that kind of shows you what I've just gone through. So the hormone, the first messenger, it could be something like adrenaline, but there are other hormones as well. Receptor, the G protein, activation, and then adenyl cyclase is activated. ATP is converted into cyclic AMP. And cyclic AMP is that second messenger. That one there is the second messenger. Now, I didn't show on the previous diagram, there are two ways that it can kind of have an effect and cause the message to kind of be passed on inside the cell. The first one is that an ion channel can open. So this channel protein, whoops, I didn't want to do that. This channel protein could open. Sorry, technical difficulties. And the second thing is that enzymes could be activated. So you should be writing those down. So whilst I'm faffing with this pen. Yeah, okay, so channel protein could open. And enzymes could be activated. So the channel protein might, for example, allow, let's say, for example, something like calcium into the cell, which could trigger a response, or it could activate enzymes. But there are also other ion channels that it can work on. It doesn't have to be calcium. Okay, so that's most of the new content for the lesson. So what I'd like you to do really is just to read over that page 64 and 65, make sure you understand it all, and then I'd like you to answer those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 questions in your book, and I will pause the video, and then I'll put the answers up here on this PowerPoint, and then if you just submit that work on Teams, showing just a picture of all your work with green pen of your answers. Okay, so by now, hopefully you've answered those 6 questions. And now here are the answers. And I'd like you to mark those in green pen. And once you've done that, take a picture, upload your work on Teams, and I'll have a look at it. All right, see you next lesson. Bye-bye.